Here to discuss this even deeper, Phil Rucker, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House bureau chief for The Washington Post, Brian Klaas, professor of global politics at the University College of London, a Washington Post columnist and host of the new podcast, Power Corrupts. My dear friend Matt Miller, former chief spokesperson for the Justice Department, Ambassador Bill Courtney, who served as President Clinton's special assistant for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. He is now with the RAND Corporation think tank. And Barrett Berger, a former federal prosecutor for the Southern and Eastern Districts of New York. Barrett, you're getting the home court advantage because you're here with me in the newsroom.
Great.
In any normal time, a regular person like me would think, holy cow, Giuliani's documents subpoenaed, possibly Mike Pompeo. This is huge. But we've seen subpoenas come flying from Democrats for months and months, and this administration has said, beat it. Should we believe this time is any different, that Democrats are actually going to get anything from Rudy Giuliani?
Yeah, I mean, exactly as you said, if we can learn anything from the past, I think we can expect a fight here. So I think there's one thing that's very different with respect to the Giuliani materials that they've now subpoenaed, and that is this idea of waiver. Now, if we think about it, that means that to have a privilege, to have an attorney-client privilege that would protect your communications from having to be disclosed, you have to show that they were confidential, right? So the one thing we know about Giuliani is that much of what he's been doing now has been played out in public, that he has been very open about the nature of these communications. He's been putting some of these text messages that he's had up on Twitter. So that could be a significant thing that takes these out of the protected category.
What does attorney-client privilege mean? Is the president currently a client of Rudy Giuliani? Is the United States government paying Rudy Giuliani? Is the president? Because all that we're talking about is not pre-2016 when President Trump was running for office. This is all official government business, and Giuliani's a private citizen.
That's a perfect question. I mean, to have a privilege attached to those communications, they would have to show that the president was actually Giuliani's client, that these conversations were made confidentially, and that he was actually seeking legal advice. This can't simply be Trump engaging Giuliani to go out there and serve as some sort of government emissary speaking with the Ukraine. That's not traditional legal advice. So the attorney-client privilege is actually a pretty narrow privilege, and I'm not sure that it is going to actually protect much of the communication between Trump and Giuliani.
Ambassador, what should we make of the fact that Secretary of State Pompeo, we now learned, was on this specific phone call? You are an expert on Ukraine. You have been part of several administrations. Would it be normal for the Secretary of State to be on this kind of call?
Yes, it is normal. For example, I was in the Oval Office with President Clinton. Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot often was also there for the call. So that's quite normal. What is not normal is that the administration has not revealed Secretary Pompeo's participation or his listening until now.
Does it seem strange to you, then, that Mike Pompeo had said he hadn't read the whistleblower's report yet, just a couple of paragraphs? If you're Secretary of State, there's a whistleblower complaint about a phone call that you're on, Ambassador, would you not read that straight away?
Typically, a Secretary of State would be briefed in detail by staff, including legal staff, probably read such a document.
Matt, let's turn to Bill Barr. An administration official told NBC that President Trump's outreach to the Australian Prime Minister was a normal kind of thing that is done when any head of state wants help. The fact that Bill Barr, though, would be reaching out to another country, how is that anything that has to do with the Department of Justice or the rule of law in the United States?
So, it's not unusual for an attorney general to talk to law enforcement or intelligence officials overseas to ask for help in an investigation. I sat in on dozens of meetings that Eric Holder had with foreign officials, and you would usually go into that with a list of things that you wanted cooperation on, and you'd ask for assistance. But there are a number of things that make this case anything but usual. You start with the fact that the Attorney General is taking such a personal interest in talking not just with one official, not just with two or three, but that he's actually flying overseas with the express purpose of just to follow up on this investigation. You add to the fact that he's pressed the president himself to talk to foreign leaders and pressure them to cooperate. That is incredibly unusual, especially because this underlying investigation relates to the president himself. And so if you're a foreign leader and you get that call from the president, you wonder, is he asking on behalf of the United States, or is he asking on behalf of his own narrow political interests?
Matt,
and it must give you pause.
Do you wonder, or do you know?
Well, of course you know, and that's the point, is that you feel pressured to do something that maybe is not in your own national interest and maybe is not something that the United States needs for a legitimate interest, but to pursue the president's personal grievances. And that gets you the problem with this investigation in the first place. This is not a normal Department of Justice investigation. It doesn't appear to be a criminal investigation because they can't just launch criminal investigations with no predicate. There are rules around that. It's not an inspector general investigation, which is the way you would usually handle something like this. In fact, the IG is doing something similar. It's like Bill Barr has sort of been given roving authority by the president to just kind of run around the entire government, oversee the intelligence communities, look inside the FBI, and try to find any wrongdoing. And even if he doesn't find wrongdoing, the mere fact of the investigation allows the president to continue to spin out these conspiracy theories that there was some deep state conspiracy to come after him, and that is a deeply troubling action for the department to take.
Brian, that goes right to you because you have said all of this has drastically changed U.S. foreign policy forever. That's not a surprise. Didn't we kind of know this would be the playbook?
Yeah, I think this is unsurprising, but it's still extremely damaging. And I think what's really happening here is two politicizations. You have the politicization of foreign policy, where Trump has clearly sent the signal to foreign governments all around the world, not just in Ukraine, that if you try to give him political benefits or personal benefits, he could potentially reward you with foreign policy benefits. It's creating partisanship in diplomacy that should exist to further national interest rather than Trump's interest. And the second politicization is of rule of law, which is extremely dangerous because the difference between democracy and authoritarianism is that rule of law and justice is impartial. It's not supposed to be a wing of the state for the president's own gain. And so to have Bill Barr acting in this way, where he's looking much more like Trump's lawyer than he is like the lawyer for the United States, is something that's going to take a very long time to roll back. Because once people believe that these two things are political and not out for the U.S. interest, changing that perception is going to take many, many years ahead, unfortunately.
Phil, let's talk about the administration's defense strategy. It seems that they've had a return to, as Donnie Deutsch puts it, CAP, confuse, attack, point the finger. That is what the president, Rudy Giuliani, and other surrogates did around the Mueller report. And I'd say the administration was happy with how that ended up. Is that what they're doing again?
Steph, that's exactly right. They're returning to this familiar playbook for President Trump, trying to undermine the whistleblower, trying to distract by bringing up the Bidens at every opportunity, and just trying to ride out this storm. But the problem that the White House faces right now is that there's a set of facts that are just damaging for the president. There's no other way to put that. And what you're seeing on Capitol Hill is the president's Republican allies are giving these talking points that sort of lack intellectual consistency and honesty. And, you know, Speaker, or rather Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy got a lot of criticism for the interview he gave on 60 Minutes over the weekend, where he just could not put together a really forceful and strong and believable defense of the president. And so I think at the White House, they're trying to sort of figure out how to navigate all of this. And of course, it's the president himself who's coming up with a lot of these plays and coming up with a lot of the talking points.
Well, let's go to what the president said just yesterday about the whistleblower. Watch this.
Mr. President, do you now know who the whistleblower is, sir?
Well, we're trying to find out about a whistleblower. When you have a whistleblower that reports things that were incorrect, as you know, and you probably now have figured it out, the statement I made to the president of Ukraine, a good man, a nice man, knew was perfect. It was perfect. But the whistleblower reported a totally different statement.
What do you make of what the president said, and what does that do to other potential whistleblowers and people inside the administration?
Yeah, I think it really calls into question sort of two main legal ideas here. On one hand, it's this concept of whistleblower protections. We have statutes that protect whistleblowers from retaliation.
If we do, then why would the president, who is surrounded by legal advisors, be able to say the things he said over the last 48 hours, and none of those people stand up and say, hold on a second?
That's a fantastic question, and I think it's a real failing on their part from not preventing him from stepping into this area where not only is there potential retaliation against a whistleblower, but we're also treading dangerously close to witness intimidation. We have federal statutes that make it a crime to intimidate or try to deter somebody from testifying, from coming forward as a witness. Here you have this individual who, in an act of immense courage, came forward to speak up against the President of the United States. The president's tweets, his comments, his suggestions that we should treat these whistleblowers or spies, as he calls them, the way we used to treat them, implying some sort of physical violence, go right up to that line, if not crossing over into witness intimidation here. So I think he is really treading in dangerous area and completely undercutting the whole purpose of having these whistleblower protections in the first place.
All right, well, Phil Rucker, no doubt these statutes are sitting in a law library somewhere, but they don't appear to be in the White House. Is the White House actively trying to pursue figuring out who the whistleblower is? Or is this the president's bluster, sort of just using his bully pulpit to scare the current whistleblower and possible future ones?
Well, Steph, I don't know the extent of the investigation to figure out who the whistleblower is or, by the way, who the sources that informed that whistleblower complaint might be. But we can just take the president at his word when he says he's trying to figure it out and trying to find that person's identity. And that desire to find the so-called, leakers or sources in the administration fits a pattern of behavior by the president. He has gone after sources for journalist stories. And remember that anonymous op-ed in the New York Times about a year ago. He was determined to try to find out who wrote that op-ed and has pursued this line of inquiry for the 3 years he's been in office.
Brian, is there a danger that there are so many developments and distractions and subpoenas that could end up in lengthy court battles that it becomes white noise to the American public?
Yeah, I think this is a serious danger. It's what I call information overload, and it's a tactic that a lot of leaders use to try to obscure their wrongdoing by basically bombarding the public with so much that they can't keep up. And you think about just yesterday, right? I mean, Trump effectively called to arrest the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee for treason, something that can be punishable by death, for something that he did lawfully. He did his job, and the president is saying we should arrest him for treason. And that will not be a story by tomorrow. It's barely a story today. And so I think that's one thing we have to be really careful about, is to not lose sight of the big picture here, that these actions are mounting as impeachable offenses. Because the more that he does, the more that we have to retain them and ensure that we don't forget, and that they have to be added to the list of things to be investigated, to be brought before congressional committees, and ultimately to be added to articles of impeachment.
But at the same time, what does that do to the president's brand? Ambassador, take me to the mind of America's enemies, other foreign leaders who are our enemies. How do they see this, including the president calling for the arrest of another government official, and it's not even newsworthy?
Well, let's call them adversaries rather than enemies. But in Russia and China, for example, governments would believe that they had the right to ferret out such individuals and punish them. But they also understand that in a democracy, that's not the way democracies work. So they'll be a bit surprised that President Trump is publicly calling for finding the whistleblower and basically accusing that person of treason.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.